The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today, Demystifying Viscosity Analysis with Clariti. While we give everyone just one more minute to go ahead and sign on, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Dr. Zachary Imam. Dr. Imam obtained his PhD in biomedical engineering from the University of Texas at Austin and spent a year postdoctoral continuing development on a bioscience project funded by the Department of Energy's Basic Energy Science program, studying the biophysical properties and functions of microtubules. Today, Dr. Imam will be presenting about RioSense's data analysis software Clariti and doing a live demo, and it is my pleasure to hand the reins over to Dr. Zachary Imam.
Thanks for the introduction, Eden. Hello, everyone. I'm Zach, and like Eden said, I'll be walking you through some of the basics with our data analysis software, Clariti. So it's built in-house, so it's proprietary, so it only works with our systems. So with that being said, I'll go briefly in, like we do with every webinar, talk about our microfluidic system, m-VROC, which stands for viscometer rheometer on a chip. It combines microfluidics and MEMS technology in order to measure viscosity via pressure drop along 4 pressure sensors in our rectangular channels. This pressure drop can be correlated to, this pressure drop across the 4 pressure sensors can be correlated to the shear stress that the fluid experiences while it is being flowed through our microfluidics channel. And then we can use the measured shear stress and the controlled flow rate, which can be calculated into a shear rate, use these 2 parameters to then calculate the dynamic viscosity. In this equation, this process, this technology is consistent across all of our platforms, from microvisc to m-VROC to initium 1+. So with the basics in mind, I can now move on to how to export data from Clariti. So right here is the window for the initium software. So Clariti was first developed for analyzing initium data. And so this will focus primarily on the initium. However, you can use Clariti on the m-VROC. You can import the m-VROC Excel export into Clariti and then analyze your data that way in Clariti if you have an m-VROC on hand. So this is the initium window. Like I mentioned, this is actually the data window. So that's why the data tab is highlighted. And no matter which window you choose, the top part of this window will always be highlighted. It'll tell you the temperature of your chip, of your syringe, of your tray. At this point, this screenshot, I was actually running another sample, so you can export your data while you're running your next sample. It had just started, so it was cleaning the auto sampler at the time, and it can even tell you which solvents are being used at the time. Also tells you what chip you're using. So anyway, so for this particular application, it's arginine hydrochloride formulation with bovine gamma globulin. You click on the left here to highlight the data that you want. And if you want to click on multiple data sets, you hold the control button, similar to when you want to open multiple files in your on your computer. So as you highlight everything, it saves. So what you want to do, or it saves in the temporary memory of the software. So what you want to do, first things first, is to clear everything. This just basically clears the memory that the software reads, and then start clicking. And then once you've highlighted all the data that you want to export, you then hit the select button here. And then once that, and it'll, think and take some time, but then it'll prompt you. And then you want to export to a database file. So Clariti reads everything in a SQL database format. And so that's what this export will do. However, if you don't have Clariti and you have an initium, that's okay. You can export the initium data as a CSV file or even an Excel spreadsheet. So we make it easy for you. You can choose whatever you would like. In fact, when you're starting up with Clariti, you can export both your data as both a database for Clariti and a database as an Excel to just kind of like play around with your data as you get more familiar with Clariti. And so I'll take a step back and say that initially I'm just going to show you different screenshots of the software and everything, and then later I'll go into a live demo. And I encourage you to ask questions during the live demo. I have Stacy here with me. She'll let me know if there's been a question, and then I can hopefully answer it or even demonstrate it once I open up Clariti. So with that in mind, move on to the next. So when you open up Clariti, this is what pops up. You have your file, your select data, analyze, and report tabs. This will all make sense once I open up Clariti in a few minutes. So this is what it looks like when it opens up. And then when you want to import a database, you go over to File, Manage Database, click on that, and it will open up this window. Here I have a ton of data because I collect a ton of data here at Rheosense. And when you import a database into Clariti, it saves it in this window, so you can go back to it. You don't have to constantly reopen databases or re-import databases. So then to import a database, you click this database plus sign here, and when you click on that, it'll open up your operating system's file explorer format or window, and then you click which file you want, hit OK, and then it will load it into this window. Then you select whatever database you want, and then you select Load Database. And when you do that, it will load the database into the Clariti window here, and it will give you some interesting information about your database. So like whatever you named it will populate here, what day you took this, or what day the experiment was ran, the username of whoever ran that experiment, as well as the chip identification number. And then if you highlight the name of the experiment here, it will actually tell you what you named it, the loading protocol you used, measurement protocol that you used, as well as the cleaning protocol that you used. So you have a bunch of information that Clariti will give you when you use it. So then when you select the Analyze tab, it will move over to the next window, and you can see all the data points that you used, or that you have, that the instrument read out and exported into Clariti. And so in a bit, I will go through what all of these mean and what all of these do and what it looks like and how to play around with it. I didn't want to do that with a series of hundreds of screenshots. That seemed kind of excessive. I thought it would be much more beneficial to you as a demonstration. So I'll show you that demonstration in a bit. But this is what Clariti looks like. And you can also click here on this graph icon. And the one that I highlighted is this data set that was highlighted red, which Clariti flagged as poor data quality. So if you click on the graph here, it'll pop up this window and we'll show you what that transient curve looked like. And so this transient curve obviously had some kind of bubble in it. So we could reprocess this data, and then on the next slide, I will tell you what each parameter of reprocessing means. And so to reprocess the data, you could, with the default settings, you can go ahead and click reprocess, or if you want to change the parameters, you can click this window and it'll pop up a new window, which I'll show on the next slide. When Clariti reprocesses something, it'll basically analyze the entire steady state curve. to do that reprocessing and then flag it as either successfully reprocessed, so it could be quote unquote rescued and be usable, or it may flag it as unstable and unusable. I would assume Clariti would call this unstable and unusable since this bubble is very large. However, if you think this data is good, that you could use perhaps the transient plateau here in conjunction with this plateau here, what you can do is you can go and refer to that raw data file, that raw data export in Excel, and you can do the averaging yourself. As of right now, Clariti does the whole thing. You can't pick and choose which part of the transient curve you want to use. I believe that's for CFR compliance purposes. Okay, we have a question.
I think you may be addressing this now. The question that's coming in is what criteria is used to flag the data from that segment that was flagged as red?
Oh, yeah, that great question. That is exactly what I'm going to be talking about right now. Thank you. Okay, so so the question was, what criteria does Clariti use to flag the data point? And so Clariti uses 4 main criteria when it flags a data point. So the steady state portion of the curve is fit to a quadratic, a second order quadratic equation. And so it fit to these coefficients, 0.0001 and for A, so the term in front of the squared component, and 0.007 for the B, which is in front of the other term. And so if it's out of range of this by 2, if it deviates too much from this, Clariti will flag it as poor data quality. And so this is one way Clariti flags data quality. So basically, if the steady state portion of the transient curve is not flat, for lack of a better term, it starts rising dramatically later or decreases dramatically, Clariti will flag that as poor data quality with these 2 terms. The next way it flags data quality is what we call the relative change in viscosity value, RCV. So we look at 4 consecutive data points. We subtract the maximum and the minimum relative change in viscosity to determine if an air bubble, for instance, has passed through. And so if they deviate too much, if those 4 data points deviate wildly, then that will be flagged as poor data quality. So on that previous example, I'll go back one slide. What happened here is these consecutive data points were deemed no good, and so because of a bubble, and so it flagged that as poor data quality. So this would have passed the quadratic terms, but it wouldn't pass the RCV. And so so next we have the yield, which is just the percentage of failed data points. So sometimes, like if for instance with that example where there was just a few points that were bad, we could kind of force Clariti to accept it as good data by changing this value of the yield. So the yield is just the percentage of data points that fail that we say, that's okay. So the minimum or the default, I would say, not the minimum, but the default is 5% of data points. You can increase that up to 20%. And then here we have, I guess the last thing that Clariti uses, but to determine the goodness of the data is, or the quality of the data, is the R-squared values. So R factory settings of R-squared values, I believe, are 0.998. So if the R-squared is less than 0.998, Clarity will flag that as poor data. However, if I'm being a little bit more liberal with what I would accept, I typically bump that down to 0.996. So with data reprocessing, I would say do not mess with the coefficients of the quadratic equation. That may do some weird things. What my approach for Clarity is to change this R-squared override to 0.996 and then see if that data passes. Usually it does pass. If it doesn't pass, I'll look at it again. And if I still want to accept that data, I will go ahead and change both the yield and this percentage of failed data points, both of them, to the same number. So 10%, 10%, 20%, 20%. And then if it still fails at that point, then I typically deem it, okay, this was bad quality data. I'm not going to accept it. But if you really, really, really need that data, or you still think Clarity is being too strict with its parameters, then I would go and change this parameter or this parameter. So the process, again, is to first start with R-squared override, then change the yield, and then change the RCV. And then I would recommend to not change the coefficients of the quadratic equation. So then here, I'm just going to show two examples of qualified versus unqualified data. So here, I did reprocessing. You can tell because this window is green or blue. We go back again a couple slides. This is like a purple color, so I hadn't clicked reprocess yet. But here you get this light blue, which shows that you've reprocessed the data. And so here it's basically Clarity reprocessed only these 2 points and deemed it okay. And then here, Clarity looked at all the points that are highlighted in green or red. And so this was a huge bubble. So there was no rescuing that. And with bubbles like this, they can influence the curve here. You can kind of see it's on a declining trend. It's getting smaller as it gets closer to the bubble, and then it looks really crunchy, as I like to say. And so I wouldn't even try changing the yield on this one. I would just say, okay, this is non-qualified data. And so one more thing with Clarity, if you want to export m-VROC data into Clarity, it's a very similar process. You go to the file, manage database, open the window. Now you select this middle button, and then it'll open up a window, and then you can select your m-VROC data that you want by clicking open, and it will import it into Clarity. And now with that, I am going to switch screens and go into the Clarity demo. So hopefully everyone can see the Clarity screen. So this is Clarity. Have file, select data, analyze data, and report. And so I'm going to click file, manage database. And you can see that it opened up. I have a ton of data. Like I said, it saves everything. So this is all the data I've ever collected here at Rheosense, although I have cleaned it a little bit. So you can delete databases if you don't need them anymore. So I can do this. Make sure you want to delete this database. Normally I would click OK, but you can go ahead and just cancel. And so Clarity has a lot of analysis capabilities, including calculating intrinsic viscosity, calculating the WRM correction, as well as calculating or estimating the hydrodynamic contribution of the injection force. So I'll start with the injectability. So I took this data way back in May. So I will open this. So, so here I have the date I took it. I named everything after the date, what I did to collect the data. Here you can see the data is consistent because Clariti tracks what date, username, and then the chip I used. Another question. So, question. So the question is the R squared of the quadratic fit, or the R squared of the pressure drop the same value reported in m-VROC? It is the R squared of the pressure drop. That's a great question. Thank you. All right. So here, like I said, you can highlight it and you can see the loading protocol I used, measurement protocol I used, and the cleaning protocol that I used. And then if you hit this little arrow, it'll show you which run. I only used one vial, so I only have one run here. And so I have the sample name, 150 mg per mil of bovine gamma globulin in this buffer formulation. And then if you click this arrow, it'll show you every single segment within that run. I typically just highlight everything and go. So once you highlight everything, you can go click the Analyze tab. If you hit the Select tab, it'll take you back to the previous selection page. So I want to analyze this data. I go over here. And as you can see, Clariti has flagged a lot of things red. This was generated using this feature of the Initium software called Level Generator. So the first 3 steps are priming steps. As you can see, you can highlight over these squares and it'll tell you priming, priming, and then this says excluded, reprocessing available. So with priming steps, you can't reprocess the data, unfortunately. However, you can, if you like your data, you can actually like force it by clicking. However, then you have to re-click everything you want to include. So if it does this, what you can do is just select everything again. And as you can see, the priming steps are highlighted in white because they're special segments. The software typically, when you select priming, it quote unquote throws that data out. Although if you like it, you can kind of force the software to accept that data. So I'm going to preview this. And you can kind of see here that the data, like I say, is a little crunchy. That's probably because it's at a low % full scale. By default, the parameters that Clariti shows you are the preview graph of the transient curve, what segment number, chip temperature, flow rate, apparent shear rate, apparent viscosity, and the standard deviation of that viscosity. But if you want more, you can right-click and go to Show Column Chooser. And then you have this little window here. So you can incorporate the sample name if you want. You can incorporate the reprocessed standard deviation. You can put the shear stress. You can put the percentage full scale. So we can see what shear stress was measured, % full scale. So at low % full scale, the data is noisier. So we can see if Clariti can, if we want to keep this data, we can see what will happen. So like the R squared is 0.9968. So if I want to change the reprocess parameters, I have 2 ways of doing that. If I just want to reprocess one transient curve, I can do it directly here and change everything. However, if I want the entire set of data to be reprocessed the exact same way, I go up here at the top, go to reprocess, go to parameters, and then I will change everything here. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to 0.996 and click Save Settings. And so now if I go to this graph and I go to Reprocess Parameters, it's saved here. If I had changed it in here, I would have had to change it in every single one. It only saves this particular transient curve if you modify the parameters in the curve. So that's just a quick caveat. So go ahead and hit reprocess. So now it's flagged, it's taken more data and it's now flagged 2 points. So if this says it's failed the forward advance, so that what that's telling me is it's flagging the data as unstable. It failed this the RCV. It failed the RCV values. So if I wanted to change that, I could go and say, well, maybe I want to keep everything. This looked fine to me. So I can reprocess it again, but it still fails to forward advance even after all that. So I think this data is probably not good quality enough. And you can see even here, it says data not stable. So it's just too noisy for Clariti to accept. And then we go to this transient curve, you can see that the R squared is saved, but that me changing the yield is gone because I changed it in that specific window and not up here through the main parameter window. So go ahead and reprocess this. And again, it's probably going to have, oh, it's failed the R squared. So this is 0.995. This is, if this one failed the forward advance. So we go over here, it says yield less than 95% and data not stable. And so, and then this one, this is a big bubble. Yeah. So we can see viscosity versus time here. If we want to confirm that it's a bubble, we can look at pressure profile versus time. And as you can see here, it's measuring the pressure at each of the 4 pressure sensors in our microfluidic chip. And we know it's a bubble because the bubble enters the first pressure sensor, then the second pressure sensor, third, fourth. So it's traveling along the channel. So here we know for sure that this was a bubble. So I'm not going to reprocess that data. So once we go through that, we can look at, say, another good rule of thumb with analyzing data through Clariti. We actually flag what's the maximum viscosity in this run or the minimum viscosity in this run. I would start there because sometimes you'll get a big pressure change when a bubble goes through, especially when with a bubble like this one. So it might alter the data a little bit. So we can look and see, and it's just, this looks fine to me. And we can even go back to the pressure profile and see everything is fine. It's just noisy. So that one's good. We can look at this, and again, I might increase this yield because maybe it's okay. Because yeah, this didn't meet the minimum data quality, and it's still flagged this because again, it's pretty noisy. But like I said, I can kind of force Clariti to accept this data by just clicking that if I wanted to, and I'm going to go ahead and do that for this demonstration. And we can look at this red data point, and we can see there's some weird pressure drop happened here. We can look at the pressure profile, and it happened here on the second pressure sensor.
Can you comment on, if you have a bubble going through, that even the data in it looks reasonable, it can shift into
Oh yeah. Okay. So yeah. So if you have a bubble go through your channel, that's a good question. When you have a bubble go through your channel, it can sometimes affect the next measurement as well, because it can alter the baseline measurement that the instrument makes before it makes the main measurement. So what happens is before the instrument begins recording information, it takes a baseline signal of the channel, assuming there's fluid in the channel, and then the instrument moves, so we can kind of tell what the environment is like in the channel before we take the measurement. And so if there's a bubble in there, it changes how the signal is read later. So, and that can affect multiple segments. So that's something to watch out for. And then, let's see, we have more questions. How much difference do you observe between the data processed by the initium and the data processed by Clariti? You can get some major differences. Actually, it's kind of surprising. It may not be in this particular data set, but let's see. We can look at, let's say we'll look at this one. We'll hit reprocess. Okay, it got flagged as poor because of this hump, so it got rejected. But we can look at, say, here. These are all right here at the same shear rate, and this one is uniquely large. So we can look at it, hit reprocess. So originally it was 7.2 millipascal seconds. We hit reprocess. It got accepted, so it's green, and now it's 7.196. So that's kind of showing that what happened is, the original initium value was here, but then when we reprocessed the data, Clariti added one more data point to the average, so the average went down. And so sometimes that can happen. You can reprocess this. That was 7.161. It's actually now 7.162. So there are differences, and you can get some big differences. Basically, reprocessing in general adds more data points to the average. That's probably the biggest difference between the data processed by the initium and the data processed by Clariti. And so now we have a new lowest viscosity reading. We can reprocess that. It actually increased from 7.113 to 7.116. And now we have this one. We can see what that does. It now went up from 7.113 to 7.122. So it does change. So I think this is good enough for the purposes of this demo. So I'm going to go and proceed to analysis. And so now here's the analysis tab. It has everything listed here. The different indices, the temperature, the shear rates, the viscosity values, what have you. For some reason, it accepted. I must have clicked the wrong one to accept, but in any case. So what you see here, I'm going to go back and deselect that. I don't want to select that one. I'll select this one. So what you'll see here is you'll see on the percent RSD and the standard deviation, you'll see this not a number. So this sometimes happens in Clariti where it's really, really strict on what it averages over. And so what's happening here is we have a really tight window on what it deemed as the same shear rate. So if you look here at the shear rates, we have 713 inverse seconds, and then we have 2,139 and 2,140, 3565, 3566. To me, those are 3565 and 3566 are the same. However, Clariti is being very, very strict right now, and it's saying no, these are two completely different shear rates. But because there's only one segment that has this shear rate, it's flagged as not a number because you can't make a standard deviation from just one segment. So to fix that, we can go to average on. And so now we've turned off the averaging. And so now we have each and every segment that we had measured and that we had analyzed and accepted into the analysis tab. If you want to put everything all in one chart like this and then do the averaging in, say, Excel, you can click this and name it, say, all data, no average. And then you get whole data, then Clariti outputs a graph that has all the data without averaging. And you can export this data to Excel and then average in Excel. If you want, you can just click this button and then it will export the data to Excel. You can name it whatever you want and save it, and then do the data analysis in Excel, or you can even do it as a CSV file, whatever works for you. But if you want to keep it in Clariti, you can then reselect the average button. And so we know that the tolerance for the shear rates were too strict. So if we click this measurement protocol group off, and then we change the shear rate to 5%, hit OK, it now lumps everything together because 3565 and 3566 are within 5% of each other. And so now we don't have any nada numbers being flagged. Everything's hunky-dory. And so now to analyze this data for injectability, I'll again select everything, and you can select whichever points you want, but for ease, I'm just going to select everything and name this 150 mg per mil BGG, and then hit continue. And then now in this window, I can either close it and then look at my data here, which I can, if I left click, I can change I can format the axis however I want. So I want this logarithmic, and then it'll look like this. If I right click, I can then reset the scale, compare data, copy the image to a clipboard to then put in a Word document or whatever format I want. I can then change the chart properties, change the border, the font, what have you. I can also change the x-axis data type. So right now it's in shear rate. I could make it based on temperature, inverse Kelvin, segment number, what have you. I can do the same sort of thing with the y-axis data. But for injectability purposes, if I again click Add Data Series, I can go here and apply the injectability analysis. And so now it does it automatically. And so now outputs a new chart of the injection force on the y-axis as a function of the viscosity of the different points here. And that's assuming the parameters down here in this table. So these are the default parameters. So to get to this window, if you go here, you can go to maximize and it'll pull it out. And so you can change whatever, you can input your needle parameters or syringe parameters, however you so choose. So if you have a really, really long needle, let's say 20 millimeters, that can affect the injection force. As you can see here, it went from 11 to 17. We have a whole bunch of needle gauges. So if I want, let's say I'm going to inject with a really long and wide needle, I can then gauge 20 needle and see now the injection force is very, very small. And it's assuming this injection rate. So I can, instead of 100 microliters per second, I could say 500 microliters per second. And it changes the injection force here. And I can also change it to 30 gauge needle, and it changes the injection force again. I can then, knowing my viscosity is 7.16, and I have, let's say my cutoff for injectability is 10 newtons, it will tell me what injection rate I need what's that cutoff, assuming the needle length, the barrel inner diameter, the needle inner diameter. So if I go back to 20 gauge, it changes everything again. So this is pretty handy. The one caveat is this only really works for fluids that are in the Newtonian regime. So you look again, if I click this window here, this restore, it'll take us back to our charts. If I go back here, you can tell this is Newtonian because the viscosity doesn't change all that much as a function of shear rate. It may be more obvious if I go and change the axis. So this is a really narrow window. So if I go to 0, oh, that blew everything up. Let's do 5. All right, so then you can see here that it's pretty consistent across all these shear rates. So it's Newtonian, we can apply the injection force here. And then finally, if you want to put this all into a pre-made report, you can hit the report tab, and Clariti will then prompt you to name this report. We'll say 150 mg per mil BGG injectability. Hopefully I spelled that right. The reporter name, and then hit continue. We can even put an image on here, but I have no images to go with this. So, and then it's thinking, and it will then build this report. And so now it says injectability, the date, who made this report, first chart, second chart, our needle assumptions, and then a whole bunch of other parameters that we can use for our analysis later. So, and then we can go back to the Analyze tab. So then we can perform new analysis, create a new report, say we want to change the needle assumptions again. Can do that. So we're running a little long, so I'm going to go now to the WRM data. That's pretty quick. So go back to the Select tab. I've already imported this data, so I can go and click Select right away. And as you can see, you can't add any more databases to do that. You have to go to File, Manage Database. So Select Database, and I'm going to go get some data. Let's get this one. So this is some hyaluronic acid data that we collected here earlier this month. Again, we have the experiment name, date, who ran it, and what chip it was ran on. This was ran on an E-chip. So I select everything, it will select everything. And I'll go to Analyze. So now we have all this data. And it'll give us an average viscosity here. And so hyaluronic acid is a pretty large polymer, or at least this one it was. So, so it's shear thinning. So this average viscosity value doesn't really mean anything. It'll make more sense on the next slide because it's constantly changing as the shear rate changes. So like we started at 242 reciprocal seconds and ended at almost 850 reciprocal seconds, and the viscosity changes from like 1300 down to 600. So this average doesn't really mean anything. So we can go through and look at each step, see how it works. So this was what we would normally call a priming step, but we didn't select priming, so it's incorporated into the analysis. It started from a dry channel, that's why everything is 0. And then it got wetted. So in this case, I would probably not use this data just because the baseline would be wrong because it's a baseline of a dry channel, not a wetted channel. So I'll deselect that, come over here and look at this. Looks pretty good. Look at this. Looks pretty good. Look at this. And it looks pretty good. So I'm not going to reprocess this data. However, if I wanted to, just because this is a different database, because I opened Clariti before and saved this override at 0.996, it still remembers that. So if you set everything up at the beginning of your time using Clariti, it'll remember everything. So if you were doing data analysis in the morning and you were reprocessing data, you input reprocess parameters, and then you had to go walk away, but you kept the Clariti window open, and you came back in the afternoon and continued to do your data analysis, Clariti would still remember what parameters you put in as long as you didn't close Clariti beforehand. So that's a neat trick. And so I'll go ahead and proceed to analysis. Since I didn't process anything, it looks like there's no funny business with the averaging. So I'll go over here, select everything, call it 3% hyaluronic acid, hit continue. And then if I can go ahead and just do the WRM straight away. So I can create a WRM series, close that. So now I have both the corrected and uncorrected data. And so if I want to plot them both at the same time, I can double click the legend and I can click show. And then if I want to make them crazy colors, I can. So I'm going to make this one burnt orange. I'm going to make this one purple, because why not? And then I'm going to select OK. And so now you can see the two data sets on top of each other. And this makes sense to me. So the WRM correction is a correction for a system that assumes that all fluids are Newtonian, but the fluid that you're measuring is actually non-Newtonian. So our system, we assume that every fluid that goes through is Newtonian. So we'll need to perform the correction. The reason being is that non-Newtonian fluids have a higher than expected or higher than anticipated shear rate at the wall. And since non-Newtonian fluids, and specifically this shear thinning non-Newtonian fluid, decrease in viscosity as shear rate increases, the output shear rate that the instrument calculated is incorrect, and also the viscosity value that it then calculated is incorrect because the fluid decreases in viscosity as the shear rate increases. However, the instrument measures shear stress, and shear stress is the same whether your fluid is Newtonian or non-Newtonian. So what the Clariti does is performs this correction that we use to correct for non-Newtonian data, and thus the shear rate will be increased once the correction has been performed correctly, and also the viscosity will decrease once the correction has been performed. So you can see that the original has a lower shear rate and higher viscosity than the corrected data, which makes perfect sense to me. And so, and if we wanted to make this logarithmic, we can. We can look at the data. We can even make this logarithmic if we wanted to by just left clicking. So yeah, so that's the quick and easy WRM correction in Clariti. So if your data is not Newtonian, you can just one click correct it. And so the last bit of Clariti that I wanted to share with everyone today was calculating intrinsic viscosity. I have a couple data sets that I would like to show you. And I also get to demonstrate where precision is key when you're calculating intrinsic viscosity. So I need to grab this data that I took last month, I believe. So go down here and all right. So yeah, oh, I took it on Valentine's Day. So so Valentine's Day, intrinsic viscosity. Again, same thing as before. Experiment name, date, who ran it, chip type, and select everything. And then again, if you have priming steps, Clariti automatically flags that as ignore. But if you wanted to, you could force it if you think the data is good. So when I do intrinsic viscosity, I always reprocess everything because, again, we want everything to be as precise as possible. So we want it to be really strict. And so I actually, if I want to be really strict, I can clear the filter, go over to the filter tab and say strict filter. And so now, instead of 0.998, the criteria is 0.999. Hit OK. And then I'll apply the filter. And so now it's applied the filter to everything. And then if that's still not good enough, I can then go to the reprocess tab. I'm going to change the parameters to factory. And then, or actually to keep it the same as the strict, I'll go 0.999. Save it. And again, you can see it. I go to the parameters. It saved as 0.999. Hit reprocess all. So everything past reprocessing, it looks like. So then I'll go ahead to proceed to analysis. And so when I want to do intrinsic, I have to know my concentrations. So what I did here was the buffer itself, you have to run the buffer by itself, no proteins or polymers added. Then I had 10 mg per mil, 20, 30, 40, 50 of bovine gamma globulin. And so this is where I'm going to demonstrate where precision is key. So I'm going to put 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 as my concentrations. All right, then I'm going to select all the data, put all data. And then I'm going to select intrinsic viscosity. And so now I have intrinsic viscosity data. And this is bovine gamma globulin, so I know the molecular weight is about 150,000 Daltons. So I can put that there. And now we can look, again, pull up this window so that we can see everything. And so we can see, again, the molecular weight that we already know, the temperature, what the intrinsic viscosity is between the two equations, the Huggins equation or the Kramer equation. I prefer the Huggins. The first term parameter, the hydrodynamic radius, and then the R squared. However, as you can see, the R squared is low, and even Clariti has flagged this R squared as low. Well, why is that? It's because I assumed that I was perfect and had the precise, clean concentrations there. So actually, I didn't have these concentrations. I had something slightly different from that. So I kept track with what I actually loaded into the vials. So it was actually 10.69, 20.18, 30.80, 40.43, and surprisingly, I did exactly 50, so that was lucky. So now I did that, and you may have seen the charts shift a little bit, which is good. You can then go down, and that was supposed to change. So let's try again. Let's see. Well, I'll click this again. So if you click this, you can delete everything. Yes, delete this series. Okay, intrinsic viscosity. Put in 150. And boom, okay, 0.99 or 0.9885. 0.9885. This is what I expected because I did this before presenting. And so we can see now that the data is not being flagged as poor anymore, so that's good. And so I have confidence that the intrinsic viscosity here is correct at 6.375. That's good. I can, once I have this data processed here, if I want to refer to it later, I can save everything as a reference series. So we'll just call this reference series. I'm going to put today's date so I can find it. All right, and so now that I've done this, I'm going to go and look at another data set that I collected for intrinsic viscosity, which was basically the same formulation as this one that I just showed you guys, but with the key difference that I incorporated arginine hydrochloride into the buffer. So I'm going to, again, select everything, analyze. Again, it remembers I have the strict filter, so everything is strict. I'm going to hit reprocess all. Then I'm going to go to proceed to analysis. I'm going to click here, and I'm going to do BGG and acetate plus arginine HCl. Hopefully I spelled that right. And then I'm going to click, well, before I do that, actually, I skipped ahead. I went too fast. I need to apply the parameters. So I'll go quickly. 0, 9.81. I wasn't as good this time as the last time. 19.27, 30.43, 40.24, and 50.07. So not as exact as before, as the arginine without HCl, or with acetate without arginine HCl. So then going to select everything, BGG with HCl. I'm going to click intrinsic viscosity, and again 150,000 Daltons, and again have a good R² value for both the Huggins and Kramer. And again, you can see here the intrinsic viscosity value is 5.949, which is smaller than the intrinsic viscosity value without arginine HCl, which if we remember that arginine reduces interactions of the globular proteins, it quote unquote effectively makes them smaller. And so this kind of makes sense that the intrinsic viscosity value would be smaller here because there's arginine HCl in the formulation. And so, and I can even pull up that reference data. So if I go to open and go to reference, it will then populate everything, and it'll even remember everything that I did. So this was the reference data, 6.375. That was without arginine HCl, and then with arginine HCl, 5.949. So you can do your data analysis. You can save it as a reference series. It will remember what you saved. It will even say its reference, and then you can use it to compare other data. However, you can't alter anything. As you can see, everything's kind of grayed out. You can't alter it once it's become a reference series. And so with that, I am done with the demo part of this webinar. So thank you, everyone. And if you have more questions, I'll be happy to answer them here and now. Okay. So here we have, how do you interpret intrinsic viscosity? How does it compare to viscosity? It's a great question. So intrinsic viscosity is assuming infinite dilution. So your protein polymer colloid is alone by itself in solution. It's the only one around. And so what is its like default behavior is what the intrinsic viscosity value is in that sense. But you can back me up here, Stacy.
Yeah, you also comment on the cost of convenience because it's being viscosity per se, it's that first word.
Yeah.
You just described it as it's gonna have to be.
Yeah, and so also it's different. It has different units than viscosity. Again, because it's this first order term of this expansion series in colloid theory. So it's more of a theoretical calculated property than viscosity itself. So that's a very brief overview of what intrinsic viscosity is. However, we do have more webinars that dive into what exactly is intrinsic viscosity in much more detail. So I would refer to those. But as a 30,000 foot overview, you can imagine it as your protein polymer colloid alone by itself in solution. How does it behave? So, all right. Any more questions? I suppose not. Well, thank you again, everyone, for attending. I hope you enjoyed the webinar and hope you found it useful in your data analysis. Thank you.